how do you describe moisture to people in a space, in any given space, and the terms that you use to describe that?
Well, let's start with dry bulb temperature, or temperature, or this little number right here, 75.5 degrees Fahrenheit. That's what we want to call sensible temperature. We want to call it dry bulb temperature, whatever. It's the temperature of the air measured by a standard thermometer freely exposed to the air without being affected by moisture content in the air, such as this, right? This is just I think it's a cooking thermometer that my wife had. I grabbed it this morning just to have it here on my desk in case I wanted to show it. And it's driven by a bulb, a glass encasement with mercury inside, and it's scaled with regards to degrees Fahrenheit. And the warmer the air in contact with the tip of the bulb, which contains the mercury, the more of the mercury will creep up the thermometer and measure temperature based on what it's exposed to. That's dry bulb temperature. It's the temperature that we realize when we're sitting in a space and we go, it's too hot, or we go, it's too cold, right? That is traditionally dry bulb temperature, sensible temperature, whatever the case might be. Now,
so you called it a couple of things there before you leap on. You mentioned sensible temperature, dry bulb temperature. I think you mentioned something else as well in passing, but like typical in the built environment, we have 2 or 3 ways of describing everything just to freak people out. But this is dry bulb makes sense to me. It's the bulb of mercury in that particular case, or whatever the fluid is, that's dry. It's separated from the environment. It's purely temperature. So it's just measuring the temperature in that
correct.
Space. Is that different from radiant heat?
It is. Now let's back up to sensible temperature for just a minute. And let me correlate that with dry bulb. Sensible temperature is simply the temperature that we sense. It's sensed by something. It's sensed by the thermometer. It's sensed by us through all of our skin's exposure to the environment, right? It's the temperature as sensed by something. We call it sensible temperature. Because of that. Your question then was, ask that again, because
because when we talk about temperature, I often hear people talk about radiant heat, of sensible heat or sensible temperature, as if there's a difference between the two of them somehow. So before we get into anything that interacts with moisture, there's different types of temperature. Is there, or is that just Yeah,
I guess I would say there is. There's what's called radiant temperature, right? And that might be, for example, you're in a room and the walls of the room and the ceiling of the room are at a warmer temperature, perhaps, than the space air in the room, and your body's at a little bit colder temperature. That surface will emit heat, electromechanical or electroradiant heat to the environment in similar fashion to the way the sun does, right? The sun radiates heat towards the earth. It doesn't heat the air. It heats surfaces that it comes in contact with. So a warm radiant surface in a room, for example, can emit heat towards your body, which is cooler, without having an impact on the temperature of the air. So unfortunately, the thing that we many times disconnect from a conversation on comfort and compliance is that radiant temperature is important. Sensible temperature is important. The amount of humidity in the air is important. And it's the 3 in combination being properly controlled that will truly result in, superior comfort or compliance, whatever the case might be.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah. So I think for listeners to kind of, if I can recap on that slightly, you've got the sensible or dry bulb temperature. So that's the temperature of the air in the space. I'm guessing also the sensible temperature is the contact temperature of something as well. If you were to touch something, so it's just the temperature that thing is in contact with from a thermal perspective. Radiant heat is radiation coming off, whether that's infrared panels or radiant heat from a wall or a surface or a warm road, on a sunny day. That's the effect of radiant heat hitting a cooler body of something, and it's absorbing that energy in a
Correct.
different form.
Let's go back to that sunny day. You walk outside to your car on a hot sunny day, and let's say it's 80 degrees Fahrenheit. not terrible from a standpoint of sensible temperature, the temperature that you sense in the air. And you walk over to your car and you touch the roof of your car and you burn your hand. Well, what's happened is the sun has emitted radiant heat energy to the surface of your car, which has absorbed that temperature and that heat into the body of the car. It's increased its sensible temperature to now be above the sensible temperature of the air, because the air is an impact in that interaction between radiant heat coming down and hitting a surface and the air itself. So the air is relatively cool, the surface of the car is relatively hot, and that's the same thing can happen inside a building with perhaps warmed surfaces, walls, ceilings, and floors, either impacting that heat emission to your body and warming it up, and or a surface. You might walk over, and if the sun's shining in a window on your desk and you touch your desk, the desk is maybe 10 degrees warmer than the sensible temperature of the air surrounding it. So it all comes into play. And of course, now that warm surface in the space can conduct heat to the air, because you've got a temperature difference between a warm surface and the air in the space. So the air heats up, right? And it's the dog chasing the tail. If all haven't been taken into consideration in the design of the building and the design of the HVAC system, and maybe using shutters or blinds to keep the sun out, you've got a problem, right?
And like all good thermodynamic laws, they're all chasing equilibrium all of the time. So they're all, whether they're hot or they're cold, they're all trying to find a balance somehow. Like you say, that dog chasing its tail, I think, is a wonderful kind of mental picture there. Okay, so we did heat. Sorry about the rabbit hole, but I think it's really interesting to get kind of, because you hear these terms floating around and often you dismiss them. Someone like me that's not in that space will dismiss them without actually articulating them properly or asking the question. So I think it's nice to stop sometimes and go, okay, hang on a minute. What do we actually mean by that? And how's that different from that, for a lay person? So that's heat. So we're talking about dry bulb. I'm guessing there's a next here.
So let's talk humidity, if we might. Let's talk real quickly relative humidity versus absolute humidity. So I'll equate relative humidity to walking into a room and there's a fish tank in front of you, right? And let's say that fish tank is half full of water. So if someone were to ask you, how full is that tank? You would say it's 50% full of water or moisture, whatever you want to call it, right? But we haven't defined the size of the tank. The tank could be a 1-gallon fish tank, 50% full of water, in which case there'd be a half a gallon of water in the tank, or the fish tank could be 10 gallons, 50% full, in which case you'd have 5 gallons of water in the tank. It's the same relative amount of water in the tank, but the absolute amount of water in the tank differs substantially. And we know with air, it will expand and contract with temperature. So I have an expanding and contracting tank. And if I have a contracted tank, right, it's cold and the air is contracted and it's 50% full of water. It's like the small fish tank. And as I heat that air and expand it, if I were to keep that same concentration of moisture in the air at 50%, I would have much more moisture in the warm, expanded air from a standpoint of literal water molecules in the air that need to be condensed to dehumidify the space properly, compared to that of the colder air in the smaller tank. That's the problem with relative humidity. It's really defined as it's a measurement of the actual amount of water vapor in the air compared to the total amount that the air could hold at its current temperature, expressed as a ratio. And I know that's a little complex, but it is a ratio. And we are saying, for example, this sample of air is at 50% relative humidity, meaning it's holding 50% of the air that it can hold at that temperature. Now, if it were to hold 100% of the air that it could hold at that temperature, you'd have condensation occurring. The air would be saturated to be 100% relative humidity. But until I define how big that sample of air is, right, I don't know the absolute amount of moisture in the air based on relative humidity alone. I need to look at some absolute measure, such as the grains of moisture, or the dew point temperature, or the vapor pressure of the moisture in the air, so that I can say for every 1 pound of air that I process through my dehumidifier at 75 degrees and 50% relative humidity, I need to remove X pounds of moisture from that air to be able to dehumidify it and then obtain the temperature and relative humidity that I want in the space. And it's all about dehumidification load sizing at that point.